And yeah, I'm very excited about the energy of this conference and everything that it'll accomplish in terms of working together. So this is Google My Desk, My Drum, and yeah, I'd like to sing for you. Walaliak kisok, walaliak ang titnog madut. Ijik surao sudamaya. Abugwan winin iskaminu muktuada sualinin. Yo ya 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 yo. Abugwan winin dandeli el nu osumarie. Abugwan winin dandeli el nu amalkal tudie. Abugwan winin dandeli el nu keda begiarie. Abugwan winin iskami nu muktuada sualinin. Yo ya yo ya yo ya yo ya yo ya yo ya yo. Abugwan winin dandeli elu osumarie. Abugwan winin dandeli elu amalkal tudie. Abugwan winin dandeli elu kedebegiarie. Abugwan winin iskaminu muktuada sualinin. Yo ya yo ya yo ya yo ya yo ya yo ya yo. Tahoe, good vibes, everybody. Let's have a good meeting today. Thanks.
Thank you, Walala and Raymond, and welcome to Landspeak. Before we begin with our session on land story, I just want to acknowledge that Land's partnership of for Creating and Oral Culture at the University of Manitoba, Centre for Canadian Studies, College Dublin, and the Dobbin of at University College Dublin, as well as volunteer donations from our audience members, which you can make by link on Hop-In. Also wanted, as a conversation flowing after each session, we can meet on Hop-In the open sessions, and you can use the network button. So feel free to explore the on the page now. We first speaker today is Aubry Hansen. Here's the complete on the Landspeak website. So we'll have a very brief greeting and welcome from Dublin. Hanson and Oein DeBhairduin, and we look forward to hearing your work.
All right, so good morning, good afternoon, everyone. It's really a pleasure to see you all, and I hope you can hear me loud and clear. I know the sound's a little choppy on my end, but sometimes it can feel like that when we're bridging such vast different distances. And I think it's kind of amazing that we can greet each other in this way across these technologies and across our lands. And I want to echo the sentiment. Thank you, Raymond, for the opening song and beginning in such a beautiful way. That the energy of this gathering together across the seas is very cool. It's an honor to be here. My name is Aubry Hansen. I am a member of the Métis Nation of Alberta, coming to you from the Treaty 7 region of Southern Alberta in Canada. And we acknowledge here the Blackfoot, Tsuut'ina, Stoney Nakoda First Nations, as well as the homeland of the Métis. I want to acknowledge the organizers of this wonderful event because I know it takes a tremendous amount of effort and dedication and relationship to put these things together. So thank you so much for inviting me and for the opportunity to share with you today. I have a scripted piece that's a little literary something I've been playing with. I'm calling it Morning Coyote, Midnight Fox, Urban Métis, a Métissage on Presence. And there are no visuals, so you don't need to actually watch your screen. If you're feeling the fatigue in your eyes and in your mind of always being on your computer, I encourage you to step away, to look out the window and take in the season where you are, or to just close your eyes and listen. Thank you so much. I'll begin. On our morning walk with the dog, my partner and I see a coyote just there. A magpie stalks her heels as she stands still, regarding us. I've seen coyotes in the city before, but never in our neighborhood, which is fairly urban, a busy part of the relatively inner city. I suspect that the magpie is cautiously trying to chase her away. The magpie recruits a friend, and they chatter together, giving the coyote a swoop with their glossy white, black, and blue wings before retreating to the safety of a nearby spruce tree. I regard the coyote, taking in her calm, silent demeanor, keeping an eye on my dog, who is equally still and calm, simply watching this creature he has never before seen on our morning route. I'm briefly grateful, as I often am, for how docile, how unexcitable he is. He is 115 pounds, just over 8 stone, of slow, quiet pleasantness. And so we stand, the three of us, my partner snapping a few pictures to show the kids later. Watching the coyote, I wonder at her stillness and try to ascertain whether or not she is lost. In the slow march of seconds that is our silent companionship, my brain takes many paths. I remember the last coyote I'd seen in the city, a bigger, bushier-tailed one that I'd seen closer to the parks along the river. That one had seemed less out of place, rushing purposefully across a road and disappearing into the brush on the hillside. I remember my partner's stories about the coyotes on the family farm in northern Alberta, who would romp with the dogs in the daytime, but then lure them out at night into the woods, where any incautious dog might be torn apart. I remember what I know about the growing numbers of wild creatures in the city. Recall an exhibit we went to in England one time that documented the growth of the London fox population, which makes me remember the late night in Dublin a few years ago when, after listening to Indigenous elders and storytellers over an international conference dinner, something not too different from this one, 4 elders, 4 stories. We had stepped out into the dark, humid night to undertake a nocturnal stroll to our hotel, not too far from Elm Park to St. Helens. Along our walk, we saw foxes. 1, 2, 3, 4. Remembering the foxes makes me remember the bats we'd seen the night after that. Our conference in Dublin had concluded, as conferences sometimes do, in a jolly social evening at a public house in Portobello. When it was time to go home, building on the success of our walk the night before, we had stepped out once again into the Dublin night to stroll back to St. Helens. On that much longer walk, we watched for foxes, but instead, as we put our feet onto the bridge to cross the river, we found bats. Dozens and dozens of them, completing their complicated aerial loops over the water. We stood and watched them, marveling at how the lives of so many other beings go on without our knowing of them all around the world, and what a gift it is to be able to witness someone new, even for a moment. If you've been following Indigenous theorizing on Turtle Island, you'll know that a great deal of critical attention is being given to Michi-Sagik Nishnabeg scholar Leanne Batassa Simpson, and for good reason. With her fierce mind, rigorous logic, and quiet refusals, Simpson has been articulating challenging and inspiring visions of Indigenous resurgence for more than a decade. Particularly compelling for me and my work of late is her notion of presencing. This notion arises in the context of bringing Indigenous knowledges and traditions, or ways of knowing, being, and doing, into the present tense and into action. The world in Indigenous knowledge systems is shaped by webs of interrelationality and interdependence between animate beings, and indigeneity is not just a state of being, but rather of doing. Indigenous peoples are still here, despite centuries of attempted genocide and erasure. We are still here and going about our indigenousness, she says, as we have always done. I talk to my mom later that night on the phone, and I tell her about the coyote. She lives here in Calgary too. This city is home since my grandparents moved here from Saskatchewan in the 60s. As a Métis family, we will always be prairie people, called to the wide open grasslands and expansive skies of the plains. But here in the city, we sit nestled with the prairies to our east and the reassuring backbone of the Rocky Mountains to our west, comfortable in the rolling foothills with valleys drawn by the Bow and Elbow rivers. Calgary is a massive city in terms of sprawl, with its footprint often compared to New York City, including the boroughs, despite its much smaller population of about 1.5 million. While we have a lot of park space and even wild places in the city, it's not common for us to see coyotes where I live. However, I've heard more and more stories lately about wildlife sightings in local neighborhoods. A couple of weeks ago, my neighbors even spotted a bobcat who had been successful catching a jackrabbit under the trees in our courtyard. I wonder if it's the lockdown that is causing this growth in urban wildlife stories, or if it is a much more slow-moving dynamic brought on by habitat destruction and climate change, or if maybe my perceptions are simply off and that these animals were always there, and I'm only now beginning to pay attention. On the phone with my mom, she tells me about a show she watched on TV that told the truth about urban wildlife, that they're here all the time, that coyote you catch a glimpse of only so rarely is, in fact, spending its nights behind the quiet corner next to your garage. Wild creatures are ever present in the city. Simpson's notion of presencing is heavily influenced by the thinking of Yellowknives Dene scholar Glenn Coulthard, in particular by his formulations on grounded normativity within the book Red Skin, White Masks. Building on the work of the Black and anti-colonial theorist Frantz Fanon, who came to critical consciousness under French colonial rule, Coulthard takes a materialist-informed approach to understanding Indigenous resistance. Grappling with notions of recognition for Indigenous peoples, such as those provided through the mechanisms of the state, Coulthard advances the contention that Indigenous peoples instead need to be rallying for resurgence, and are doing so. Seeking recognition from a colonial government, Coulthard contends, simply reinforces the power and legitimacy of the colonial authority. Conversely, Indigenous struggle from the roots up, from within Indigenous political systems and epistemologies, recognizes as legitimate the power and authority of Indigenous peoplehood. Grounded normativity, then, is the everyday practice of resurgence in Indigenous lives. Living out Indigenous presence means enacting indigeneity here and now, bringing the enduring ways of our peoples into the present. After that phone call with my mom, I reflect back on my quiet moment of stillness, standing there, watching the coyote, watchful for any signs of distress or agitation, expecting that she was off her usual route since she had made her way into mine. But what if she was just as at home as I was? What if she was an urban coyote, adept dodger of city buses and swift catcher of plump hares? Why had I assumed she was out of place? After all, she had not stood there for long, but had trotted off through the spruce trees, dodged down a side walkway, apparently on her way to somewhere. She had given us no sign that she was lost. We, in turn, had continued on our loop with the dog around the park and back home and had not seen her again. Presumably, she had gone on about her business, just as I had gone on about mine. How could I know what home meant to her? The central thread of my current research, which I am undertaking alongside Métis scholar Vicky Bouvier, pursues the misconception that Indigenous people are out of place in Canadian cities and seeks to unsettle that misconception by looking at how Indigenous artists are expressing their creativity and presence in urban spaces. Indigenous arts are unsettling the settler colonial city, I know, reasserting that this has always been and continues to be Indigenous territory, and that Indigenous people belong here, integral within the webs of relationships that make up contemporary urban life. Urban Indigenous peoples are, of course, not the same as urban wildlife, but still, why had I viewed my friend the coyote with the assumption that she did not know her way around my neighborhood? I've been sitting for a few years now with Coulthard's writing on grounded normativity and with Simpson's notions of presencing, thinking about how they relate to Indigenous arts in Canadian cities. Indigenous artists are using their creative practices to express Indigenous presence in urban spaces. Guyanese artist Terence Hull, for instance, in his Urban Indian series, challenges notions of contemporary urban Indigenous identity through a photographic collection that depicts him going about the business of everyday life, riding public transit, working in his cubicle, shopping for groceries, in full traditional regalia. Métis writer Katharina Vermette, in her novels and poetry set in Winnipeg's North End, foregrounds urban matriarchal kinships that enable Indigenous women to endure and transcend ongoing colonial violence. These everyday urban women are remarkable. They remind me of my aunties. These artists' work unsettles the colonial city. In these places where Indigenous peoples are thought to be out of place because they are supposedly part of a long-lost past, or because they allegedly live elsewhere on distant reserves, as Lenape and Potawatomi scholar Susan Dion might point out, or because they have apparently assimilated, Indigenous artists are unraveling those untruths. Indigenous artists are taking place in the city, not out of place. The fact is that more than half of Indigenous people now live in cities in these lands claimed by Canada. More than that, they're mobile and adaptable and resist the static understandings of urban versus reserve or remote. Through their everyday acts of being here, Indigenous people are undoing the narrative that they do not belong in urban spaces. We are already here. And when we tell each other our stories, show each other our paintings, share the intimacy of each other's bodies in motion and voices in song, we are engaging in that urgent, resurgent presencing that will change everything, that is changing everything. The challenging and immense task of dismantling the colonial structures that restrict Indigenous well-being requires a range of tools, in my view. The pen of policy, the chair of negotiation, the blockade of refusal, the oratory of community engagement, and the bead and sinew, brush and paint, body in motion, and voice in song of Indigenous arts. Bringing the theory and practice of grounded normativity into action through everyday presencing, as Simpson shows us, is a powerful process of Indigenous love and brilliance. For we so love the brilliance of our ancestors and of our great-grandchildren to come, that we continue to tell the stories of our people. By remaining grounded in the lifeways and knowledges of our nations, we carry forward who we are as Indigenous peoples and as individual beings in relation with other beings. Indigenous arts and creativity are undermining the colonial narratives that tell us we are not here, we do not belong, we have lost our languages, our knowledges, our kinship systems, our means of survival, our ability to govern ourselves. Indigenous arts are in fact weaving together some very different narratives of Indigenous endurance, of Indigenous resilience, of Indigenous resurgence. The challenge for the future is that it cannot only be our own people who are listening to and lifting up these stories of Indigenous presence. I'm right here sharing my creativity and aliveness. Will you witness my presence and unfold it into the web of relations that shapes your everyday lifeways in turn? It's clear that in telling you this coyote story, I'm really telling you my own. I'm weaving a narrative that allows me to see myself standing there, witnessing her presence, a narrative that I will present for you in the hopes that you and I can in turn step into relationship. What might arise, I wonder, in the space between us? What might we be able to learn from each other? In that moment of witnessing the coyote, I see what she has to teach me, that I'm here, that I've always been here, that I'm not lost, that I know my way around. Marcy, thank you.
Aubrey, thank you very much for sharing that. Sadly I missed the very last part due to technical difficulties that we're all sharing, but very much appreciated and very authentically touching. And I appreciate this kind of space being kind of cultivated together by Renée, and also the wonderful warm opening by Raymond, which was stunning. You may have noticed in the kind of the introductions, my name is DeBhairduin. I'm an Irish traveller. I'm in care, which means that I'm part of the Indigenous ethnic and nomadic community of here in Ireland, which we are about 1% of the population. And part of what today was to I suppose, to explore our stories, our narratives, and our language. So one of the things I wanted to do was share a story from a collection of books I published last year by Skene Press. It's called Why the Moon Travels. And very unusually, even though it was 2020, it was the first collection of traditional travel folk tales that was ever drawn together by a traveller and illustrated by a traveller. Which might give people an understanding of where we are in the socio-economic and kind of cultural kind of platform that is Ireland. Although it's quite well known for literacy and engagement, and not all of its children are there around the table at most times. So the story I want to talk to you about is called The Yew Tree, or traditionally it's titled Tharspo Sharko. And I'll just get straight in. I spent a lot of my childhood in graveyards, not in a morose way, but in the way that many people from the travelling community spend time in graveyards. Travellers don't always have a permanent place in life, so when we die we mark the ground with a stone to show that we were there. We visit for funerals, of course, and the quarter mass. We also visit the graves of loved ones on their birthdays and grief days and high holidays and when extended family come to town. Every relative, every loved one, every kindred friend is remembered. When we go to graveyard to between among those who stand at the edge of our shared experience, our dreams remind us of them and sweetly sung songs evoke their memories. Keep them alive in our stories of how they were and where they existed with us on the wiry brambles of our ancestry. For all the free and able, traveller or settled, whose hearts were light enough to carry them through the streets of Troon, we always went to the quarter mass on the 6th of June, St. Garrett's feast day. We don't willingly go to sorrowful places with a heavy heart in case the carrying of them would mire us to that place. There is the old graveyard, and then there is the new graveyard. And in this centre is a large space filled with unmarked famine graves. We were gathered in the middle, packed tightly around the graveyard in a huge gathering tied together by invisible strings. In the west of the old graveyard, there is a grey sandstone memorial cemented onto the wall, which is marked with no traveller's name, but is for all travellers, remembered and forgotten, buried in unmarked graves and unnamed places in the Tuam graveyard and across the grey world. Unbaptised and nameless traveller children were usually buried in unconsecrated ground, in the cradles of ancient sites, latrines near holy monuments, blessed wells, and other sacred places. On rare occasions, however, traveller children will be buried in the consecrated soil of the graveyard, which would otherwise be barred from them for neither having name or the grace of baptismal water. Those who had recently lost a friend, a relative, or even a neighbour could lay the still children at the feet of the deceased. Little baskets would be tenderly carried to the rest in known and untrusted arms. In many of the graves of Ireland, at the feet of those who journeyed before us, sleep swaddled children, safe in the care of kind-hearted custodians. In this graveyard, not far from my home, stands a scattering of yew trees, beaten by age, weather, and waves of grief, and they have endured from the paths of those that passed by them. I recall admiring them as a child, those beautiful solemn figures rooted throughout the sacred space. The high, cold grey stone walls and dark iron gates that mark the boundaries and the lines between the place of the dead and that of the living. One year, though, we went in June. It felt like an autumn morning, still clear, crisp and cold, but the warmth of people brought the reminder of the rising days of summer. I remember asking my father later that day where the yew trees had come from, and he told me, and almost why they're always found in graveyards. Many years ago, on a date not recalled exactly, distant enough to be forgotten, but recent enough to be still spoken about, there was a young Mincare fiend, newly married, with a beautiful child and a home filled with so much love and care that dawn brought only joy and twilight brought no quarrels. He worked the markets and she spun lace, and the bonny-hearted lacking left footsteps and smiles in her wake. His hands were rough but gentle, accustomed to hard work, and hers light and nimble, fingertips calloused with the tattering of silken lace. They lived for many years, knowing only the glow of shared kindness and the hopes of a bright future. One year, however, in the depths of winter, their home was visited by quick fever, and all three were struck by it. Their limbs were heavy and smouldering like the charred branches of a campfire. Their laboured breath was like a strangled smoke. By the second day, the wife and child had succumbed to it. On the third, the young man, recovering, and woke to his loss. His legs were weak and soft like willow. His pale face, awash with sweat like cold winter dew, bleached of its charm and warmth. He was bereft and gripped by the loss of his loved ones. His body felt heavy and dark, like peat moss and trodden by unmeasurable feet. Gushed on agony deep knit into his bones, struck with him as he moved. His once strong being, now as fragile and as jarred as broken eggshells. After the funeral, he stayed by the grave until the night had passed and fresh dawn was breaking on the horizon. His friends came, and they brought him home, welcoming him back to the world of the living with company and light conversation, poaching to soothe his heart and good food to rekindle the embers of his wounded spirit. The next day, the man he returned to the graveyard until his friends came again, and they brought him home. Each day the pattern repeated. The man who would rise from his bed to wander to the grave side. The day would pass, and in the stillness of the night his friends would seek him out and bring him home. Soon as he had returned home, he began to shun his friends, staying in the graveyard to watch over the grave of his loved ones. He stood a solitary and bewildered figure, his once bright future in ashes, the man with neither north nor south, nor the track of the road back to himself. Over time, his skin became crackled and darkened by the sun, rain and gale. His hair became tangled with twigs and feathers and spiders. As the days passed, he grew colder and fixed, rigid and moving. Even his voice, which was once warm in speech, had started to change to a mumble of light creaks and crackles. His clothes, they had withered and grew green with mildew and moss, and his tears, still sharp at loss, were round droplets against his cracked skin. His toes, knowing the earth beneath his feet so very well, grew long and tangled, reaching down to the familiar spot that rooted into his place. His nails, they coiled and gnarled and clawed through the soil and stone, snapping the tangled tendrils of the deep, dank earth beneath the topside of the graveyard. There was once a daily visit, a heartfelt privilege of remembrance and connection, had become the loss of coming home, and he had become something else. What stood at the graveyard was no longer the shape nor shade of a kind man, the good husband, the doting father, and instead a figure of cracked bark like skin, green spines from age, and red berries from tears that spilled from him. In the lock of his grief, that man had become the very first future. And this tale reminds me that grief can bind us in a rigid loss if we stand in it too long. If we come unmoving, unexploring of the world, and unwanting of company and kindness of others, we too risk becoming the lonely yew tree in the graveyard, so lost in our own grief that we can even lose ourselves. Thank you very much.
Hello, I'm interrupting the flow here a little bit because Renée was having difficulty with connectivity. So I'm just stepping in here. My name is Warren Carrio, and I'm hoping that you can hear me all right. So I'm introducing myself to our speakers as well. Thanks for bearing with us, and thanks you for your wonderful presentations. And there's so many overlapping concerns in these pieces. So I would like to. We've got about 25 minutes, or 20 minutes anyway, and I would like to begin just by thanking you for the stories, and also maybe asking if you have responses to each other's presentations first, because I think there's some really interesting parallels or connections that we might do you have I don't know, Aubrey, do you have a question for Oein, or
I do. And Warren, it's such a pleasure to see you. What a fun surprise. So Oein, Warren and I already have met. Warren's a fellow Métis scholar over here in a little east of where I am. But it's a pleasure to see you. And I do, I was thinking about the chance that we both have here just to meet in this context and to hear each other speak and to listen and to attend. And I was thinking about what it's like to come, you know, when we haven't met each other, and to listen to each other's stories and to try to get to know each other in that way. And the thing that I heard that I wanted to ask you to say more about was, there was a line in your piece about feeling as if we were tied together by invisible strings. And I don't know if I quoted that exactly right, but it made me think about kinships and stories and the ways in which, you know, I know one thing that Métis people talk about and Indigenous people often talk about is being tied together through our stories and across generations. And I was just wondering if you could say a little more about that line.
I can indeed. I think that, first of all, I wanted to resound very strongly on your own piece regarding the sense of belonging and how we sometimes interpret who belongs and who has the right to define belonging. And I think that's something that I kind of that drips in and out of my own consciousness quite a lot of the time, and that ties in very well with the idea of these unconscious connections that we sometimes have, but know on a very sacred level be real. Because even when it comes to our ancestry, very rarely do the Nagarra Traver people think of trees as ancestors. We think of the brambles because of how we are connected, not merely through branches, but through truths and fruits and thorns and misunderstandings, tanglings that have been lost in history. And they're just as valid and as vital as the sense of that kind of visibility of who has descended from someone. Because what one is a saying that my father would often say, even being a man, the only line we know is the line of our mothers, because you never guarantee who your father is. And even that itself draws a lot of kind of unusual understandings about the idea of that ancestry. But that connection, I think that it's much deeper. It's in our stories. They're not just connected in physical ways, especially as nomadic people. We're connected by our shared experiences and our stories. And a lot of those stories are about physical space. Because again, the interpretation of traditionally for travelers, land ownership isn't something that we quite understand. You can't own a piece of land. You can be a caretaker, you can have responsibility over it. You can have a shared responsibility, but you can't possess it. And so for a community that would naturally have travelled until obviously 2001 when it became illegal, that sense of connection has become even more powerful, that we're connected not only by the physical sense, but by the sheer beauty and intimacy of a tale.
Well, and it seems to me that the connection between the man and his grief and his family and that experience of becoming a tree is a very embodied connection to land. Like, it's very literal, but I think that there's a lot of significance there when we have stories of and histories and kinships around the lines not being so clear between like what is a human and what is the land and I know there I was recently reading Cherie Dumoulin's book Empire of Wild, which has a Rougarou story, and there are stories of transformation. Like, a Rougarou is kind of like a werewolf, but not like in Twilight. But anyway, these kinds of transformation stories where we remember that we're not so different from the other beings in the land where we are, I think those stories always have really important lessons in them. It's kind of an obvious thing to say.
No. I think they're not just lessons. I think they're stuff that we know. So they're just reminders a lot of the time. Because one way or the other, we are always transforming. We are always changing. Even our landscapes around us change. Like, much like your own story, the idea of security, who belongs there. Chances are that you belonged there long before there was a presence of buildings and stone and cement. And it's about looking at the wider history of a space and the people and the history, rather than this very singular, kind of almost into personal slots of how we fit into the world and how we see it around us. Once we take a step back, the world very rarely orbits around ourselves, but around the whole beautiful maze and network, all these unexplored understandings and stories that have yet to be discovered and told.
Well, your story was beautiful. I appreciate you sharing it.
Yes, thank you both. That's fascinating. I wonder if Aubrey, do you have other thoughts in relation to your story about the coyote and the coyote and its presence in Indigenous traditions? but also in the city, which is something we, probably many city dwellers are familiar with, and yet we don't seem to think of it in indigenized terms, I guess. So I really appreciate what you did with that. I'm interested in maybe if you could talk a little more about that in relation to the tree that Oein was utilizing that image.
Yeah, thank you. Well, and I don't know, I had a longer version of this that I was, I kind of got carried away writing, and I was thinking, Aubrey, like, are you just trying to copy Thomas King, or are you actually doing something different? And it legitimately, I sat down to write it. This piece kind of came out of my struggle of not having written for a long time in the pandemic, and just, other things feeling more important, and, me forgetting how nourishing writing is for me, and that I really need to do it. I need to tell stories, or think about stories, or reflect on stories, or something. I need to be writing in the morning. And I saw a coyote, and it just struck me because, clearly I don't see them, and it seemed important. And just that moment of standing there watching each other felt really laden. But there are so many stories that are written and told with coyotes in them, and they're often, like coyote is a trickster figure, a teaching figure. And, I was kind of standing there watching this coyote in front of me saying like, oh, and I'd seen a raven the day before too, like maybe there's a whole nother story there. But I was just kind of like, I feel like I'm at least being cued that I need to be attuned and to think about other beings, and to maybe consider that sense of interdependence. And the literal consequence of it for me was a return to my writing routine, which made me feel a lot healthier. It just made me feel more nourished. And I know that stories can nourish us, but I think this element of what they have to teach us. So I wonder, when it comes to the tree, and I would love to hear you, Oein, reflect more on that story, and the difficulty of grief is something that we know when we've experienced it, but I feel like there's some kind of a lesson there in going too far with grief, or maybe there's something profound in that transformation. That I guess I wonder how you interpret that story of transformation into the yew tree.
Thank you very much. So I think a lot of it comes down to the idea of, we're from a nomadic tradition, so nomadism isn't just around physical movement; it's about mindset. And anything like there's an understanding that anything that becomes fixed, becomes rigid, becomes an item of death. Because death is the only thing that doesn't change, and it can change, of course, in very different ways. But the acceleration, the changing and transformation of it is a much slower one that people see it to be very inert. And when it comes to any emotion, be it joyful or sorrow, existing only in it robs us of the experienced journey. And I think one of the emotions that we've all, in one way or the other, on a very human level, have battled with is grief, and is that loss, and is that kind of removal from ourselves, from the world around us, and in a coldness which can be protection. But that protection can be very short-lived. In fact, it strips us of all the things that we are meant to be feeling, are meant to be sharing. Like those experiences become more of communal, kind of those scars become almost like communal tattoos of identity and reference to each other. And so a kind of a lot of our tales do orbit around transformation, either people or how like the world has been transformed, how our relationship with the land and the embodiment of it is a world or unworldly, and it's part of the overall narrative of if you're of a people who quite regularly would move, you need to normalize that movement and have safety in your space. So if you understand on a different level, which is quite unusual for the wider Irish narrative, because a lot of those tales in the wide Irish narrative have been lost. And people remember the Ulster cycle and the ancient mythologies like Hulan and Hanson and all the kind of bodies. And we have some tales like why the wren, especially on St. Stephen's Day, is the king of all birds, and why a robin may have a red chest. But the general kind of Irish kind of zeitgeist, those tales are lost. They're no longer there of like why rivers flow and like why that mountain is the way it looks. And one of the things that the here kind of community has been able to hold on to are those tales and are those understandings, because not only were they protective, they also brought a lot of psychological relief to the spaces that you're in, knowing that you belong there, even if there was a common tongue, even precise now within the wide Irish narrative of being unwanted to a very severe degree. By us telling these stories, we reminded ourselves and allow ourselves to have the wings to move, but also the roots to feel secure.
Ooh, That's so beautiful. And I feel like you just gave us so many breadcrumbs of stories that we could sit for hours, I think, and hear some of these stories that you're referencing. And it's so enticing to know that they're there. And I think I'm also really, really drawn to what you're saying about mobility. I think how sometimes we think about, I've heard connection to land talked about in ways that really assume people are in one place, but there is something to, I'm not saying they're the same, but I think about mobility in relation to Métis people, because there's been a lot of movement in Métis history. People have had, we could talk about the Métis homeland being quite broad. There are a number of histories of displacement and people being pushed out of places, but having a sense of connection to land that is mobile, I think is something that is really, something I want to listen more to, and I'd love to just hear you say a little bit more about that, like about that piece of being in connection to land and place while being in motion as well.
And I'd love for you to expand as well from your own understanding, because I'm at a loss to the cultural and historical reference points that you're like the maybe kind of I suppose have a collective movement from. But an example would have been is that like one of the most recent histories is that travellers have always been seen as we're the indigenous nomadic people, but outside of the hyper Anglo sphere of identity, most people in the world don't really know we exist. But at the same time, our stories are being recorded and being archived for many years. Our songs, our musical traditions. There's all these aspects that we are there within the wider narrative, like a lot of the common folk tales and stories that people will sing and repeat, or even sometimes part of the Irish lexicon comes from our language, our own indigenous language, known as Cantor, Gammon, sometimes in their academia Shelta, which is different than Irish and distinctly different at times, and how it's almost like we can be known on one level, but at the same time Ireland has a difficulty in embracing us as kindred. And I think that's one of the reasons why, even though we are restricted from movement and how it is practically illegal since 2011 to enact traditional rights, the fascination with land, the fascination of movement is so very alive in people. And the idea of, rather than the kind of going, it's like the idea of everything has a story, everything has history, and everything has an intimacy that if you allow yourself to open up to it, you can see the world anew. I'm originally from Galway, which is the west of the island, and I've been living in South Dublin, which is the east, and I tell people in exile, for the last 8 or 9 years. And it took me a long time to feel a sense of connection here, because it's a high industrial area. I didn't have a sense of who the people were, and building those relationships weren't just with people, but with the land and the history of the land, and the parts of the land that is uncomfortable. And even within the socioeconomic places, there's places that in our areas that people would see to be of a lower economic background, and that land itself would usually be land that's poorer land and less rich, because people who have kept better land for themselves, more fertile. So there's a way of treading through those histories that travellers, because we'd had until recently the ability to move, often it was quite a part of our cultural view. You'd check where people would stay, you'd check what their movements are, and that became a very living part of us. And I think that comes through our tales, but also our want of connection. Nature is the one unifier, it's the one universal aspect that we all share in. And it's the idea of rain falls on a trailer the same way it falls on a mansion. And so it is a great aspect. So I think that's one of those common bridges that we can always come back to share an intimacy of. We may view the world differently, but it's still the one world.
Wow, thank you. What interesting interactions, fascinating things that you guys are following here. And I wonder if I could ask you to talk a little more about, I guess, being on the land, but land that has been inscribed by colonial and capitalist structures. So for me, in the story, Oein, the graveyard, it seemed to me had some elements of that, or certainly my idea of how a graveyard looks has that, the wall and the regimented kind of structure. And then for Aubrey talking about just the structures of the city, the streets and fences and everything else like that demarcate territory. But I think underneath that or around that, there's still different ways that both traveler cultures and Métis culture, I think, relate to the land in a very different way. So I'm wondering what your thoughts are on that. Maybe we could ask Aubrey to go first, if she's ready. Or
oh no, please do. I haven't shut up yet, so like, please, they all please step in, Aubrey.
Go ahead, Oein. Sure.
Oh no, I was trying to encourage Aubrey that, seeing that I'm kind of taking up a lot of space, but no, I do think that even to I suppose recently in our history, like from 1963 onwards, a lot of the spaces and social spaces, home and accommodation spaces for travellers were either in great isolation or in high industrial areas. And you can often see it even in our graveyards, the traditional graveyards, there would be the graveyards would be divided. Travellers are usually in one section. Now that could be for many reasons, that people will want to be buried by their loved ones, but also as a way of social isolation, almost like that's in traveller space. So there's a dynamic there. But you can often see that the more connections people have with people around them and the land and the connection, the history, those boundaries can be challenged in very interesting ways. Because people find it very easy to create something to sense as very exotic and very unusual and mysterious. But once you're actually known as a fellow like human person, those other narratives have an opportunity to fall through, and people are actually to connect on a very real level. And it has been difficult historically for travellers to develop those relationships due to nomadism. So a lot of times it would have connected more with the land and the passion of the land rather directly with the people. But since the greater kind of settlement, as you might call it, those narratives and those social understandings have changed greatly, and the community is even now still in adjustment to it. And it has brought beautiful blessings, and at the same time it has brought deep scars and painful kind of experiences to many people that we're still, I suppose, exploring and tentatively trying to bring a greater peace to. But I do think that how we view the world a lot of the times also kind of lets us know how we're going to find in the first place. The idea of, if we're ever in the situation that we don't expect wonder, we've disconnected ourselves from our environment, because it's forever revealing ourselves. The wonder of a high urban area is just as exciting and those mysterious at times, and how it breaks through, in that of the wild woods and forests. It's just how we open ourselves up to those experiences and how we allow those experiences to meet us where we are.
Thanks. I'll turn it over to Aubrey.
Well, my apologies. I don't know if anyone else could tell, but I think I fell out for a few minutes there. It's such as the way of things in the COVID era, falling in and out of calls that are important. So I'm so sorry. I missed a couple minutes of what you said there, Oein, and but I caught the end there of what you were saying about wonder and the urban environment not being, lesser in that sense. I've learned a lot from one of our graduate students here in education. Her name's Jennifer McDonald. She's doing some beautiful research on like land-based learning and outdoor education. And she's also been listening to a lot of wisdom teachings from a Cree elder she works with. And one of the things she's taught me a lot about is attunement and how to find wildness in the city. And that's, she says it's not just about where you're going and going away on these big adventures, but being able to inhabit a sense of openness to what's right in front of you, and to actually marvel at it, and to be attuned and alive to it, to be able to receive what it has to teach you. So I think it's interesting to think about not just going out into like looking for some sort of faraway land experience, but changing within ourselves so that we can actually recognize what's right in front of us. And I think wonder is a beautiful way to do that, and from what you've just described.
Thanks so much, Aubrey. You may have missed the first part of the question, which I think is also really relevant to this idea of seeing the wonder. And that was I was just asking about the infrastructures of Western modernity and how they have restructured our space, and yet how Indigenous peoples and have this different kind of relationship nonetheless. So I wonder, would you reflect a little more on that in relation to your own story about the city and the streets and fences, and yet the coyote has a place there too?
Sure. Well, and I feel really, really humble trying to speak to that, because I think it's just something I'm at the beginning of learning about. I don't know if anyone else feels like life just starts when you turn 40 and then you realize you don't know anything. But I feel like there's a lot of memory work to be done and listening work to be done of reconnecting to the stories past, present, and future of where I am, because I think it can be really easy to sort of default accept like the very urban infrastructure around me, or to sort of see high rises and sea trains and freeways. Calgary has a lot of roads. We're great for cars here. And what it means to actually think about what the city was like, what this place was like before the city, how it's changed over time, what the futurity of that might look like. And so really to go inward into my own perceptions and reflections and understandings and question those, but also to really go outward and listen to folks who know other stories of the land. And for me, that's really, a lot of that work's been learning from local Treaty 7 nations, like listening to Blackfoot stories of this place. And I think that work of traveling through stories and through time is really important to kind of unknowing the city. But I also, Oein, I appreciated what you said before about, I think sometimes when we're in urban space, we think we're not on the land, and everything here comes from the land one way or another. So how can we find that sense of connection where we are? And I wonder what that means to you to kind of connect and remember to these kinds of traditional stories and other ways of knowing than these contemporary urban structures. How do you engage in that practice of presencing or remembering or storying other ways of seeing what's in front of our eyes?
I think in various ways. I suppose put into context with an individual level is that about 9 years ago, myself and my partner bought our home together, our Kenya. My father came to me and said, I was the first generation of these people that ever risked being homeless, because as a people we self-accommodated. And that's quite a kind of root from the Irish kind of majority, is that people who would have had loads of experience of this kind of lack of accommodation, homelessness. But for our people, it was the first experience and the shifting of that narrative. And I think that what I do a lot of the time, especially new spaces, is the names of spaces, both in Irish, with the local kind of traditional kind of names of it, the land itself, watching the grooves of trees, especially older trees. They often show you where the boundaries of the old land was, and then where the new land is. The kind of following straight roads are always roads that have been forced upon the land. Roads that wind and to have unusual curves, which means they've been there for a very long time, have learned to grow with the spaces around them. The trees that are out of place are ones that need to, and most likely need to belong there, because they haven't been selected for their aesthetic appeal. They're there because they've grown there and they have a history there. So I think looking out for those, what we sometimes think to be anomalies, would follow the course of nature mostly. Like, very rarely are things in nature directly straight lines. Very rarely are they distinctly one single colour. So start looking at those older patterns and flows. I'm absolutely fascinated, especially here in the Irish context, because a lot of the older plantation and land ownerships that people their children have inherited land, and just say 1 acre would split into half. So a lot of land would have been reduced among some of the wider families, who would have been from the kind of settled community. And how land, even now, can force and change is so still within the infrastructure of our spaces. And even the types of places. For instance, I'm in Clondalkin, which translates as the Meadow of Dalkin, which is a chieftain. But down the road from me, less than 15 minutes, this place called Tallaght, which is on Tallaght, which is the great tomb, or place of burial. And so there's a lot of history there, and people will say Tallaght and move around Tallaght, but they haven't actually started to scratch the surface to say, what was that? And I've learned a lot from my own family and how they interpret things, even within a single generation. When I moved here, and Clondalkin has been in existence for 1,500 years, and we have a round tower, so it's a very old settlement. And my mother went around, like many Irish mothers do, check out what was here, how the neighbours were, all the kind of things. And she came back and said, akin to the story of, where is the graveyard in Clondalkin? Because people who 100 years ago would not have travelled 12 miles to bury their dead. So she became very fascinated of where everyone was buried. They built on people, and there's those understandings of going, if you lived here and the place's history, where were people who lived and died, shared, expressed, gathered, swam, and once we start looking at those things, we can see what the history still wants to speak to us if we're willing to listen to it.
Wow.
Yeah, I was
Go
worrying
ahead.
to tell him about
Just
to go down a rabbit hole.
Yeah, sorry.
You want to go ahead? A last
Apologies.
observation, Aubrey?
Well, I think there's so much more to say about how we can know and do and remember our like, I was going to say our traditional ways, but even like the ways that exist in our kinships when we think about how we're born and how we die and what happens at those times, because there's so much carried in those really huge human moments. I get the sense, Oein, you and I could talk for a long time, and it's really been such a pleasure to meet you today.
We really should.
Well,
I'd love to hear the longer
Zoom.
version. You get the longer version as well of the story, because I find it absolutely fascinating when nature doesn't really impose itself into our lives, so we're very busy, our heads are kind of always, especially in the COVID, there's all this attention, and sometimes nature goes, I'm still here, you know, and you've been beside me all along, you've forgotten.
Yep.
That's
well, and what you said about family brambles, as someone put in the comments, I love that, the family bramble instead of the family tree. I get the sense we could find a lot of not straight lines in our various stories.
I think so.
Absolutely. Well, thank you both so much. This has been incredibly rich, and I think it is the beginning of a longer conversation. And I think it also really ties in very well to the next session that we're going to have with Renée Armstrong and Manka McGann about language and land and those connections. So I hope everyone will be able to stick around and come back. I'll be back then as well. I wanted to send Renée's regrets. She's very sorry about the connectivity issues, but she's been able to listen and take part in that way. And so as we just close out this session, I want to just remind people that you can progress to the open meeting space where you can meet with others and discuss the issues and the stories that we've heard already this morning. And you can also try out the network button, which will randomly assign you to some other participant in the gathering who also has to press the button, and you can have a conversation. So it's a great platform for visiting. So thank you again so much to our panelists for a wonderful and so wide-ranging and rich presentation. And we will definitely be following the continued conversations.
Marcy, thank you.
Thanks.